also have to think about what is it about Obama, what is it about him when whites see him, right? And I remember I was teaching race course on race and film, and we were looking at Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, and I remember the way in which Sidney Poitier is depicted as Dr. Prentice. And he goes to Yale, and he has he's published some books, and he's this very elite black character. But there's something about that black character during the time of the movie that made him much more palatable to whites, right? So I'm saying that those whites who voted for Obama can still be racist based on the way in which I understand racism. So it's not incompatible to vote for an Obama and yet be racist. So in other words, then I don't take it that his election is a signification that we are in this post-race moment. I mean, it says something about America, but it doesn't tell us what is it about particular individual whites who voted for Obama and what they either had to see or forced themselves to see in order to vote for him.
George Yancy, author most recently of Black Bodies, White Gazes, The Continuing Significance of Race, links on againstthegrain.org. I'm CS, and I want to spend some time with you, George, on the book's last chapter, in which you write about how insidious whiteness is, and then you look at the etymology of the word insidious and draw some conclusions from that. What does the word insidious mean?
Yeah, sure. The word insidious, I've heard many people say that racism is insidious, but when I thought, okay, let me find out exactly what's going on with insidious, and it means subtle, right? But etymologically, it comes from the word which means it's insidiae, which means to ambush, which is a really dynamic term that captures the way in which racism is lived. Tim Wise, again, who does really excellent work on this, has been, writing about, whiteness and anti-racism for years, right? And here's a situation where he, defining himself as an anti-racist, he gets on an airplane and he sees that there are black pilots in the cockpit, and he says, "Oh my God, can these guys fly the plane?" Right? So here's a case where someone like Wise, of all people, he has this moment where, though he self-identifies as anti-racist, he has this experience where he's ambushed by the kinds of deep-seated racism that is still, as it were, in his unconscious, in his body. There's a woman by the name of Lillian Smith who wrote a book called Killers of the Dream, and she's sort of before her time. And she talks about getting together with a group of white women, must have been in the 40s maybe, and they were going to integrate this eating area. And she shares this experience where another white woman, though, as she says, clear in her conscience, felt this acute sense of nausea as she sat with the blacks at the table, right? And so there's something about it that says something about the way in which racism is not simply getting ideas right? It's not just a cognitive issue. It's the way in which, because if it was just a cognitive issue, then Tim Wise would be okay, right? This woman would have been fine. But there's a way in which racism resides in our very bodies, in our very unconscious, So I critique this notion that to be an anti-racist white is somehow to occupy some non-racist apex, right, of where one could say, I have arrived, right? Because there is no arrival in the way in which I understand this, because whiteness is constitutive of the self. And being constitutive, then it's not something that you can sort of unpack, right, in a day or in a year, over 5 years. So it's going to require what Du Bois says is long siege. That's what it's going to require, because it not only requires investigating the unconscious, but it also involves investigating the way in which one's body is fixed, the way in which one's movements are fixed. So the woman in the elevator, for an example, she may not even be aware cognitively that she's tugging on her purse, but her body has become so habituated in its movement vis-a-vis black bodies that she automatically does this, right? And so by way of thinking critically about what whites ought to do, I argue that what whites should do is to really throw themselves in contexts where they're unfamiliar with that particular kind of sphere, so that they find themselves or put themselves in context where blacks are, so that the ambush experience can be encouraged. And if the ambush experience is encouraged, then that allows them to be thankful, as it were, right, that they thought they understood who they were as non-racists, but realizing that there are depths to this racism. And so it allows a bridge for communicating with blacks, and it also allows a bridge to this stranger within, right? Call it this the unconscious expression of whiteness. It allows for this communication with this stranger within, and a critical communication with that stranger, such that one can become a more whole individual. But again, never complete, right? So this wholeness or completeness is always something that one is striving toward when it comes to whiteness.
To what extent is fighting state structures and power disparities that contribute to or result in racial oppression, to what extent is that important to white anti-racist work?
Yeah, I think it's very important. And if you, this is part of my critique of critical whiteness theorists. They've heretofore limited their critiques in an autobiographical sense. So they're talking about their own lives as whites and how they can overcome or undo whiteness. It's really a performative metaphor that they use, which has its own problems. But I think you're right. I think that if we think about the state, as it were, the state as a site of white power, then to really think about the ways in which whiteness is operative in our society, it's going to require more than simply exploring, the depths of the unconscious and putting oneself in a situation where one is bound to experience an ambush, having that ambush occur, or where one is dealing again with the unconscious or dealing with others. I think that at bottom, what is required is this issue of attacking the societal structure, the way in which racism is systemic. And without that, I think that while we'll make steps at the individual level in terms of undoing whiteness in some way, one is still going to maintain a level of power and a level of privilege in terms of how one has a particular position within that larger society.
And very quickly, George, what can and should people of color do to help whites committed to their anti-racist work? Yeah,
I think that they should feel not feel overly obligated to do so, because then you don't want to sort of carry this burden. But again, black people have carried this burden for a long time. But I think that whites can't come to terms with white racism without making or having blacks be a critical voice in that discussion. So I think it's important that we balance that discussion, because inevitably it's not whites who are suffering, although they are suffering from whiteness, but it's blacks who are experiencing that at the level of bodily injury, death, pain, etc. So it's important that we remain a part of that larger dialogue.
George Yancy, Y-A-N-C-Y, teaches philosophy at Duquesne University, editor of numerous books and author of Black Bodies, White Gazes, The Continuing Significance of Race. Again, links on our homepage, againstthegrain.org. Hey, George, thanks so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you.
And this is CS, suggesting the important thing is not to stop questioning, and we will look for you next time.